Hey everybody, this is Emily Higbee. This is Redwood Energy's Director of Research, and also Greg Pfotenhauer, who previously was our lead researcher when he was with Redwood Energy, and then he went to Canary Instruments, and then anyway, he's had a storied career and has been doing just amazing data research the whole way along on zero net energy apartment complexes. So you guys have a kind of a dream team of really experienced people with this data. We studied 4 apartment complexes. They're going to give you the insights that we learned. Take it away, both of you. Thank you so much.
Hey, how's it going? So yeah, like I said, like Sean said, we're gonna try to present some of our lessons learned from our grant project we've been working on. I'll be presenting first, and then Greg will be presenting after me. And also shout out to the rest of the team as well. Andy and Meg at AEA, Amy Dryden at Brinkland Energy, Nehemiah Stone, and then of course Sean as well.
Hey, and just so you know, everybody, if you're still here, we're going to have one last minute presentation came in on electric buses and flexible bus charging from a big company that does electric buses. So that follows right after this, and you're welcome to stick around. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Yeah, so this presentation, I'm going to talk about our project overview and in general, our zero net energy performance, discussion of some of our unseen inefficiencies, and taking a little closer look at our cooking and plug load energy use. And then Greg will be doing a deep dive into our domestic hot water energy use and our thermal storage performance. So like Sean said, it's been a multi-year, multi-project collection of data, all on zero net energy multifamily buildings. On the left here, the EPIC grant. The goal of this was to look at the technical and economic potential of ZNE multifamily construction, while also optimizing water heating performance and understanding how tenants use electricity, all to inform best practices, codes and standards, and communication of our lessons learned as well. But also we have some related work going back to 2014. And bigger picture of that was also to understand how tenants use electricity, to inform our best practices and codes and standards. And also for all of these projects, we had energy monitoring devices in each apartment. So bigger picture goal there was also to provide tenant feedback as well. So these are the project locations. There's 9 locations in 4 climate zones and a total of 479 apartments. They're all affordable housing. Some are low income family, some are farm worker, and there's one project that is senior housing. Just gonna go over the project characteristics. Like I said, they were constructed from 2014 to 2019 with fully electric, LEED Platinum, and Energy Star. And at the time that we ran the energy models, they were from 19 to 45% above code compliance. The on-site PV was projected to be for all the sites from 55 to 100%, 120% ZNE. Had all Energy Star appliances, had efficient space conditioning, and all projects had heat pump water heaters. We also had efficient walls as well, with radiant barriers, cool roofs when appropriate, and efficient windows and efficient lighting. So these are some of the projects. These are the 2050 partners data projects. That's like the related work that I showed earlier. And yeah, I'm going to talk about more specifically our CC later, and I'll show that. So still talking about all the projects though, the data collection at all sites. We have the energy monitors, like I said. In the top right corner is the Nexi, or at the time it was called Canary Instruments. And yeah, that it provided real-time tenant feedback on how energy was being used in the home with glow different colors. But also paired with that, there were monitors on the electrical panel, and that's that bottom picture there. And we're taking very highly detailed data to 1-second resolution. And also at all sites, we took metadata, the occupancy, floor area, bedroom counts, things like that. And then all sites, we did detailed energy models, and then also took photos and did on-site observations. At our EPIC grant, we took more data, more detailed data on the water flows, the pump power, and the domestic hot water tank flow and temperatures, detailed tenant billing data, tenant surveys, and we also had an on-site weather station and in-unit temperature and relative humidity. So now talking about our EPIC grant projects here. This is Calistoga and Cloverdale. So for the space heating and cooling and domestic hot water, there we had one system for each of these projects. It was the AirMech with central distribution. And you can see it in this left-hand picture for me. We had storage tanks for both hot and cold water. At Calistoga, it was 1,000 gallons for hot, 500 for cold. Cloverdale was 500 for hot, 500 for cold. And just in general, big picture, what was their ZNE performance so far? So Cloverdale was nearly ZNE in 2019. Tenant loads were net negative. Common loads were within 3% of net zero. The solar PV system, actually, from our monitoring, was only producing at 50% of its capacity for the first half of 2019. But the last 12 months, once this issue was resolved, show the whole building loads are net negative, which is great. Calistoga, it is not close to ZNE. This is mainly due to the not optimized design and operation of the AirMech. And out of the 3 common area utility accounts that we had, only the one with the AirMech was not close to ZNE, just showing that it's using a lot more energy than we anticipated. Next project is Benner. This space conditioning system was ductless mini splits, or is ductless mini splits, and they have 2 central sand-in plants with an isolated recirculation loop, and the storage is about 2,000 gallons for the whole project. And its ZNE performance, it's expected to reach ZNE in 2020. It was very close in 2019. It was designed to only offset 100% of the common load area, which does include the central heat pump water heater system. In the project design, there wasn't available roof space, and additional racking cost was prohibitive of adding solar to offset tenant loads. Good news is, though, the common load area utility cost was zeroed out for the year, and that's mainly due to the credits earned during the solar peak times. And many adjustments were made to the equipment, and this has already brought the efficiency up, and so now it's expected to reach ZNE in 2020. And then this is just showing off the performance of the sand-in systems at Benner. For most of the time, the COPs are performing between 4 and 6, which is great. So this is post efficiency upgrades, and yeah, it's performing well. And the last project I'm going to show is Atascadero, and this is the project Greg will be talking about in more detail. Space conditioning was a ducted split system with hydronic fan coil units in the ceiling. And the hot water were individual Ream heat pump water heaters, both 50 gallons and 80 gallons, and with individual distribution. So the ZNE performance is not yet ZNE. 70% of the loads are being offset by solar. Either the tenant loads or common area loads are being completely offset by on-site solar. The ZNE performance will be reevaluated once we finish up our hot water study, and we program the hot waters with the final optimized set point schedule and operating mode that we like. And the last thing, which I'm going to talk about more in the next slide, is the HVAC crankcase heaters. We're going to put a lockout control on those to only run when they're required versus running 24/7. So how did we notice the crankcase heaters? This is going into the unseen efficiencies part of the talk now. So we observed this base load at Atascadero, and it was on average 3 kilowatt hours per apartment per day. You can see in blue there, that's that base load, and the actual heating and cooling is varying in orange there. So what is a crankcase heater? It's used to warm compressor oil so that it doesn't mix with the refrigerant and damage the compressor. You can see that top right picture is a compressor with a wire wrapped around it to keep it warm. It's an example of one. And this can have power draws between 70 and 100 watts, continuous load. And not all spec sheets will say how much energy that they will use. And it's not included in the federally regulated specs like SEER and EAR in HSPF. So at Atascadero, we notice this load, and we know that it's only needed when temperatures drop below 40 degrees. So that's really less than 10% of the hours. So once we lock that out, Atascadero should be performing much better. So good news, there are industry-leading products without crankcase heaters, or they have controls on them. And here are some of the leading brands with products like that. And now I'm going into the second unseen inefficiency that we wanted to highlight. So we had, so at Atascadero, there's 2 or 3 occupancy centers for hot water, one under the kitchen sink and one in each bathroom. So these turned out to be overly sensitive, and operation was triggered more than necessary. And we noticed this from the lack of demand after they were triggered when looking at the data. Sometimes 100 times a day in 3-second cycles, in some cases over 300 times a day. So this increased our hot water energy use. It was destratifying the tanks by having all that flow running through them all the time, and also increased pumping energy and losses from the recirc loops. So these were removed in November, and push button controls were put in instead. So this graph is showing after that November removal date, we're already seeing a decrease in hot water use, energy use for domestic hot water portion and the pumping. So next thing I'm going to talk about are the plug loads and cooking loads that we observed. And this is going back into looking at all the projects and not just our CEC EPIC grant funded ones. So after hot water and HVAC, plug loads and cooking becomes the next largest load. And we observed from some of the projects, plug loads can be between 0.5 to 4.3 kilowatt hours per apartment per day. And cooking energy was between 9 to 25% of daily apartment use, and it was a lot less for seniors. I'll go into that a little bit more later. And also it's important to be looking at peak times. So especially in California, our peak time being from around 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. And we observed that about 20% at that peak time is cooking and about 25% is plug load. So going into the cooking energy, all sites had electric resistance ranges, both stovetops and ovens. All sites were similar except Lakeport, like I mentioned, which was the senior housing. They were just on average use a lot less energy. So from our data, we saw that it's between 1.5 and 3 kilowatt hours per day per apartment. And turns out it's 2 to 3 times more energy, cooking energy being predicted by the Title 24 software. There were no seasonal trends except on the holidays. And on average, occupancy and number of bedrooms correlated with more use, but there is an order of magnitude difference between the kilowatt hours per occupant. So the most variance comes from the difference in individual behavior.
That question, because the cooking is so different from what the Title 24 software says, having looked at that with you, it seems like it's both because we have higher occupancies in these low-income apartments, and it seems likely that it's underestimating the amount of cooking that low-income populations do, because there's evidence that the less money you have, the more you cook your food. Makes sense. Because it's less expensive than eating at restaurants. So I just want people to note that this critique that we have here is real. It's definitely specific to affordable housing, and it might be more, because this is the largest cooking study ever done in our country of actually metering stoves. Never before has anyone done in any real depth actual metering of stoves. So there's been a lot of surveys that have been done that's different from granular watching what happens. So anyway, this is important data, at least for low-income housing, maybe for everybody.
Yeah, good point there. Now looking at the hourly average use. So as expected, morning and evening peak, but it does vary between partners or apartments. And yeah, this is showing the average of the whole building. Except Lakeport, again, these are senior housing. There is no morning peak on average. And also important to note, there is consistent load throughout the day as well. Now going into plug loads, energy use. So plug loads are interesting because it's unregulated, it's an unregulated end use, and it's hard to predict. It's highly variable and behavior dependent. And in most cases, there's a limited opportunity for efficiency improvements. So some of the appliances that were observed at our sites, some people had water coolers, secondary fridges, large aquariums, rechargeable scooters, commercial soda coolers as well. So also important thing to note on how we monitored the data, plugs and lighting were often wired together on the same circuit, and circuits varied widely between apartments and between buildings. So it's hard to parse out plug loads versus lighting. So the numbers shown here are those aggregated together. And it was found that there's no significant correlation between plug loads consumption, occupancy, square footage, and number of bedrooms. And of course, there's a large variance between average dailies and minimum use. So this table at the bottom, although they are tentative findings, I did want to include them just to give a ballpark of the numbers that we're looking at. So this is based on 2 months of data from King City and Oxnard specifically. So just an example of how the wiring is done different between buildings. Oxnard doesn't have the kitchen plugs or refrigerator, and how we monitored it and how it was wired made it hard to do that. And then at King City, they don't have over-the-range microwaves like some of the other apartments. And it does include some lighting, or it doesn't include some lighting, and doesn't include the refrigerator and the bathroom plugs. So caveat there. But yeah, from this, what I mentioned earlier, the average daily plug loads and lightings per apartment per day between 0.5 to 4.3 kilowatt hours a day, a lot of variation. And the minimum load was observed to be between 10 and 350 watts. And then from looking at the average minimum loads of each apartment, an estimated parasitic load was between 5 and 102 watts per apartment per day.
I don't know if you have a number available, but what is just the average per day? Because you have a range here between 0.5 and 4.3. Is that a number that's exactly in between those two, or is it some other?
I think it was 0.9 kilowatt hours per apartment per day.
Okay, well that would be okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But it ranges.
Yes.
Look, shown here. Yes. Yeah, and this is looking at the hourly use of the plug loads. So, like I said, there is the large variance between apartments. Those arrows are pointing out that 10 watts for one apartment, not using a whole lot, to 350 watts at an hourly average. So this does show there is a peak use from 5 to 9 p.m. And yeah, just pointing out between King City and Oxnard, the averages turn out, these darker lines, the averages turn out close, but this is coincidental. Another caveat, more data is needed to make, overarching predictive statements about plug load use across buildings. These two apartments are pretty specific. They are affordable farm worker housing. And with that, we'll talk about some of our major conclusions. So big picture from our EPIC grant study and beyond, showing some of the other data here. Comfortable, efficient, all electric, affordable, multifamily housing is achievable, even in 2014, when some of these sites were built. At all apartments, higher than expected usage or underperformance is often the result of unexpected anomalies, like I mentioned, more often due to improper installation than behavior. So for example, the crankcase heaters and the demand control sensor. Sean mentioned this earlier, occupancy, particularly in 3 and 4 bedroom apartments with many children, is higher than anticipated by the models. And that could be due to the fact that we do have affordable housing, and a lot of them were farm worker housing. So specific population there. So kind of going with that, occupancy consumption is also consistently underestimated for larger apartments. This can be a problem for, sizing domestic hot water system. Coincident demand can lead to large recovery loads, and that peak usage that Sean was talking about, the electric resistance peak uses. So, and bigger picture, more studies that address multifamily developments with different demographics and climate zones are needed to make more conclusions, present more data, and all that good stuff. So these are resources, links, our ACEEE publications. Yeah, pretty much all of what I presented today are in these first 2 papers. So please read them or shoot me an email and I can send you a link to these. And yeah, thanks for listening.
Woo! Thank you, Emily. Fantastic. If you can hang out over there in the chat spot, people are definitely looking for clickable links. Tanya just saying that.
Okay.
Please send presentation with clickable links. And Tom, to your question, yeah, we have a lot of great data on range hood and use. I don't think we have microwave exhaust generally in these things. I think they're dedicated range hoods, but someone correct me if I'm wrong. And Greg has done some really great granular data on how they get used in coincidence with stoves and how much stoves get used. There's many more slides, and those papers include some of them. Yeah, so Greg, come on up.
So as I'm getting set here, is the audio okay? I want to do a sort of kind of sound check first.
Yep, your audio sounds good.
Great. Let's see. So can everybody see my presentation? Just want to make sure I'm actually sharing the right screen.
You are on full screen, looks perfect. Hitting the duck with heat pumps. Great.
So I'm going to try to catch us up on time a little bit. I think I have about 20 minutes. Thankfully, Emily's gone over a lot of the background of the work we've been doing. What I'm going to be focusing on is thermal load shifting in unitary heat pump water heaters in a multifamily setting. So Emily linked to the papers. You can find this particular paper also on ACEEE Summer Study 2020. So I encourage you to look at it because I'm only going to be able to kind of brush the surface, and I don't really want to talk results at you. So for more quantitative results, reference the paper or reach out to me. Just as far as background, I'm a data scientist, Franklin Energy, but the last probably 6 years of my life has been taken up in large part by just sort of studying multifamily ZNE and use patterns. If you want to reach out independently, talk about stuff, my email and my LinkedIn profile is there. As far as what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to sort of go over a little bit of background, although most of that was covered by Emily already. Talk about our optimization approach for thermal load shifting, talk about some seasonal considerations, and I'm actually going to talk quite a bit about this because I think it's important for future work. And then I'll kind of discuss each of our experiments, or at least the important ones that weren't total failures. Then I'll kind of just summarize everything. But again, just reference the paper for the results themselves. So this is all again coming out of our EPIC grant GFO 15-308, which is in part focused on optimizing water heating performance for multifamily ZNE. The site I'm going to be focusing on is Atascadero, which is one of those 4 sites that we've been talking about. And 100% ZNE as designed. We've got all unitary systems, heat pump water heaters, and heat pumps, air source heat pumps. Those are on the roof. You can see that on the right side there, along with the solar panels. Mozzie has talked about the duct curve, so I'm not going to go into detail on that. But I think we're all kind of familiar with the problem of overgeneration of solar during the middle of the day, particularly in the summer and in the spring, and sort of this ramp up period in the evening, particularly in the summer when we have a lot of AC coming online that we have to deal with. So, why is this a problem? Why is this relevant to thermal storage? Well, this is a plot of Atascadero's stacked end uses. We were monitoring for a 2-year period. If we're going to be electrifying water heaters, even efficient heat pump water heaters are going to incur some amount of additional demand, especially at those peak hours. You can see that particularly in the winter, because we have lower performance, which I'll talk about, we have fairly good coincidence with the peak, 4 to 9 window as far as domestic hot water is concerned. So, we have a big battery, essentially a big thermal battery that we could potentially do some load shifting with that doesn't require, electrochemical batteries. So, is there a way we can do this easily and inexpensively rather than spending money on expensive lithium-ion batteries or otherwise? So our general approach to this was, okay, let's charge the tanks as much as we can during the non-peak hours in the middle of the day when people aren't using hot water as much. Then we're going to reduce the set point at 4 p.m. and see how much we can limit the compressors running in our heat pump water heaters. And then once we get back to a point where the marginal greenhouse gas emission rate isn't quite so bad, we can return that set point temperature to 140 degrees or some higher temperature and kind of go back to normal. So this is kind of a complicated optimization approach because obviously everyone has a different water heating schedule. And there's a lot of criteria we kind of have to consider. So, we want to reduce total energy. We don't want to increase the amount of energy on a daily basis overall. The primary thing we're talking about here is demand reduction during the 4 to 9 period, but we can't necessarily just optimize that and sacrifice all of our other criteria. So greenhouse gas emissions, which do parallel demand, but this can't be at the expense of tenant utility bills or the quality of the hot water that they're getting, or like I said, energy. So there's a lot of things to consider, and obviously time is sort of a constraint, so we weren't able to sort of run every possible scenario. And obviously, you could do this from a modeling standpoint, but there are limitations to doing this as well in terms of accuracy and how it applies to real world operation. So with that said, these are really specific. This is a really specific case, and optimization should be kind of framed within that, within that context. So the equipment we're working with, which Emily mentioned a little bit, is Rheem Prestige Gen 4 air source heat pump water heater. It's got a 200 to 500 watt compressor with a 5 kilowatt electric resistance backup. In our 2 bedrooms, we had 50-gallon tanks and 80-gallon tanks in our 3 and 4 bedrooms. Because we had thermal mixing valves installed, we could safely get the temperature up to 140 degrees in the tank, and we have control over that throughout the day, as well as controlling the mode of the tank itself. So in these particular models, there's sort of 3 separate modes. We've got a heat pump only mode that really only uses resistance backup if the incoming water temperature, I think, is below a certain point, or if the tank temperature gets really, really cold. Then there's energy saver mode, which is kind of a hybrid mode, which tries to optimize the use of the compressor, but also does utilize the resistance backup to sort of maintain a temperature differential within the tank. And then high demand mode, which is much more aggressive and relies much more heavily on resistance element to maintain a much narrower range of temperatures within the tank. So these are the modes we can play around with. And like I said, we can change the temperature from 100 to 140 degrees or anywhere in between throughout the day. And so that's what I'm going to talk about in this presentation as far as our experience is concerned. Emily talked about instrumentation, but in addition to getting electrical energy on a 1-second basis, we had on-site weather stations. We're collecting flow from the tanks. And then again, we're getting some information from the tanks themselves, from the REAM EcoNet controls. So it'll tell us that they're for sure in, they made a state change and that kind of thing. So we're collecting all kinds of data in this regard. And I'll note just that the time frame of this experimentation was from June 2018 to June 2020, roughly. But I'm going to be kind of focusing on the period of pretty much December of 2019 until roughly June. And there is some overlap with COVID there, which has some implications, but it is what it is. So before we get into the experimentation, I want to talk about some of the sort of parameters that this is really sensitive to. So one thing we noticed early on was the seasonal performance of these heat pump water heaters is really variable. So the first thing that has a really large effect in terms of performance is just the ambient air temperature that we have available to us to pull heat out of to heat water. So in this case, like I said, they were on the roof where it's basically an unconditioned space. This would look a lot differently if they were in a garage or in a fully conditioned space. But the COP curve you're looking at, you can see that in the summer where it might be 100 degrees outside with a tank temperature of 120, we're operating at a COP of somewhere around 5. But in the winter, the same tank temperature, and let's say it's 40 degrees, we're more like 2.5 the COP. And so from summer to winter, we might have a 2-fold or more variation in terms of like average COP. So that sort of doubles our lift right off the bat. This is a plot of our daily temperature at Atascadero, sort of by month. And you can see, it's pretty cold for big chunks of the night in the winter. And so we're really operating a really low COP. February is kind of the outlier. Everyone who was in California this winter remembers that February was uncharacteristically warm. I don't think we had any precipitation for many, many weeks. So sort of an outlier there, but and we definitely did see that in the results. We saw better performance in some of the weeks in February than we did in, for instance, December. We had kind of a cold early start to the winter. The second piece that really impacts performance is just the average incoming water temperature. So this is a plot throughout the day for each month of the incoming tap water that we are having to heat. So again, this is outside, so that has some impact on the sheer difference in high to low temperature throughout the day, and it would look different at every site. But the main point being, we're going from 40 degrees to 65 degrees or 70 degrees in the winter, and as warm as 85 degrees in the middle of the day in the summer. So the sheer lift that we're having to do in terms of the delta T, going from 40 degrees to 120 degrees versus 80 degrees to 120 degrees is also roughly doubled. So another thing that's really working against us in the winter in terms of being able to effectively heat water. And then finally, not related to seasonality, but another thing that we kind of had to wrangle with was just the internal programming of the heat pump water heaters. So every manufacturer is different. They all have their own proprietary black box controls. REAM, even though we were working very closely with them, obviously wasn't going to sort of share all their secrets. So a lot of times, whether it was because we didn't really know what was happening internally, because it's sort of a programming black box, or because we didn't have any control over it, we were sort of fighting with the firmware in terms of being able to optimize when the water heater was charging the tank, or how it would respond to a certain tank temperature, or how the tank was stratified, et cetera, et cetera. So this generally reduced performance just because it was, led to unpredictable behavior. And finally, the last challenge is just, again, we're sort of implementing a top-down thermal storage regime, but everybody uses hot water differently in terms of how much and what time of day they use. So this is just a box plot of average hot water consumption for these 22 apartments that we are monitoring for the period of study. And we've got an average of 10 gallons of hot water per day up to roughly 140 gallons of hot water per day. So a 14-fold difference, and everything in between. So you can see how this would really play into our ability to effectively, shift load, and what might happen if we try to shift load for people who are already using more hot water than we could probably realistically provide on a good day. In addition to that, we mentioned earlier that occupancy was a challenge in terms of estimating loads. Well, we did sort of hit our average occupancy as estimated by software overall. We still have apartments that are outliers. So we have some 4-bedroom, 7 occupants. We even have some 2-bedroom, 6 occupants, and everything in between. So this has some implications for coincident demand. People with kids, maybe they give their kids a bath all at the same time every week, which might mean a pretty significant hot water load, or any other number of scenarios where people would be using hot water at the same time. So this sort of, as we increase the number of people, sort of exponentially makes our problem more difficult in terms of our ability to charge a hot water tank and then leave it alone for a couple of hours. So I'm going to go into experimentation now, and as I go through it, because I can't really touch all results, every single apartment, they all react a little bit differently, and averages can be a little bit misleading. I've kind of called out 2 different units. We'll call them Unit A and Unit B, and they're somewhat different in terms of their demand patterns in terms of hot water demand. So we have Unit A, which is a 2-bedroom, 2-occupant, uses approximately 34 gallons of hot water per day throughout the period of study. And their peak hot water demand is 5 gallons of hot water on average. That varies quite a bit. Unit B is quite a bit different. We have about 3 times the amount of daily hot water demand. We have 7 occupants and 4 bedrooms. And so remember, we're dealing with an 80-gallon tank here, whereas Unit A is a 50-gallon tank. And our average peak demand hour is later. It's at 10 p.m. And our average peak hot water demand on an hourly basis is 15 gallons. So these are two very different, but there's by no means the highest and lowest users that we've got in our cohort. But they're good to draw comparisons from, and I'll sort of I'll be showing each of their demand patterns for each of the experiments. So I'm going to be showing each of a slide like this for each of the experiments, just kind of orient you. I'm not going to talk about all of it in detail, but what I want you to kind of focus on is that plot on the bottom left. So that shows the average demand for that experiment for all 22 apartments, broken out by compressor and resistance. It also shows the set point, so what that temperature is, which you can see on the right side, that set point temperature. And I've also labeled the mode that was in. So for this particular experiment, this is our first experiment this last winter. We're in energy saver mode during all times of day. And for most of the day, we're at 140 degrees Fahrenheit at the tank, but we're dropping it down to 115 degrees during our peak hours. And you can see how, the response that has in terms of electrical demand below that. So this was sort of our first attempt. Came in thinking, oh, this will be easy, whatever. We'll just, charge the tanks and then everything will go smoothly. That was not the case, and I've already talked about some of the challenges in the winter that we faced, and why we weren't able to really successfully sort of just kill demand for 5 hours. You can see already at 6 o'clock p.m., resistance energy is starting to creep back in because people have already eliminated whatever storage they had at 4 p.m. So,
Greg, I want to give you the 2-minute warning for your official scheduled time.
Oof. Okay. So I'll skip a few slides here then. The full 40-minute presentation you can view on ACEEE. But in terms of those 2 units and why we saw such poor performance, Unit A, not a high user. We were completely able to eliminate demand during that 5-hour window, just because typically we'd be able to charge the tank up to 140 by 4 p.m. That was not true with Unit B or other units like them. You can see we've got quite a bit of resistance throughout the day, just because they're draining their tank and we can't keep up with demand with such low operating efficiency in the winter. So we were already sort of fighting, a break-even scenario in terms of physics, just to sort of maintain a baseline, much less try to shift that demand for some of our higher users. Similar things to some of our other experiments. What I want to touch on, though, is ultimately what the most effective strategy in the winter was just leaving it in heat pump only mode at 140 degrees at all times. And what we found was, because we have such a high variation in terms of daily hot water consumption, it was better to be really risk averse rather than trying to sort of eke out marginal savings with some of our users. So we might have one high-end user that completely obliterates any savings in terms of demand or energy or otherwise that we would achieve during the peak hours. So this is sort of the best we could do, is just sort of keep things as hot as possible and rely on the heat pump as much as possible to limit demand. Now I'm going to skip ahead to our summer operation. Like I mentioned, we have much more favorable conditions in terms of efficiencies in the summer. So not only are we able to pretty much eliminate or reduce resistance energy, just sort of baseline conditions, we also have extra energy to kind of play with during those peak hours. So this is very similar to the first scheme that we tried back in December, but we did this in June. And you can see we're able to keep it at 140 degrees for most of the day and then drop it down to 115 degrees, almost completely eliminating demand. So this is average across all 22 apartments, completely limiting demand during those 5 hours. And we go back up to heat pump only mode, and yeah, pretty much everyone's turns on at 9-10 p.m. But we don't have any massive spikes in demand, and we've been able to kind of eliminate it during those hours. So the takeaways here, without going into too much detail, are there is no sort of one size fits all approach to doing this kind of optimization. And in the winter, we have some pretty big hurdles working against us. I won't go into detail into too many of these points, but in general, a really simple, conservative, risk-averse approach seems to be what works. And especially in a multifamily setting where we might have really variable occupancy and schedules, and we might not know, how many people are going to be living in a given apartment. It makes a lot of sense to sort of design for worst case conditions. So high occupancy, winter conditions, that kind of thing. So yeah, please reach out. Again, I didn't get into everything I wanted to today, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff in the paper. And yeah, please, I'd love to talk about more. So thank you.
Woo! Yay, Greg! And credit where it's due. A lot of the graphics that Emily were presenting, that was Greg's work back in the day. We've continued, and Emily's learning from Greg, but you just saw it. The guy is a master of the data. Greg, there's a whole bunch of people who are commenting. Greg Tsai of GE, I would encourage you to reach out to some of his questions here, because they're technical, of course, and you've got depth of knowledge in that. I'm wondering if our next speaker is here. 1 second. Wendy Zhao, are you around?
I am here.
Hey, Wendy. Okay, so just to make sure, while there's a moment, I think, Greg, to reemphasize your last point, you were making the recommendation that we make a sort of a fail-safe, cautious strategy using just the heat pump. And you showed a wintertime scenario saying basically recommendation after all the other experiments that you zoomed through, but the best one was 140 degrees Fahrenheit, including during the evening peak. Just always leave it on at 140 Fahrenheit, right? And it's being mixed down to 125, is that correct, or 120?
I think the thermal mixing valves are mixing down to 125, but I'm not sure.
That's what I thought too. Well, we have to confirm that, but anyway, we both think that's what it is. Okay, so in the summertime, you're saying 115 is, you could do that. You can't really do that in the winter, right? To emphasize, because the cold incoming water.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons for why we can't do it in the winter, but ultimately, we had worse performance on sort of all accounts. In fact, we increased the amount of energy on a daily basis, as well as sort of screwing with demand quite a bit and just pushing that peak back rather than eliminating or reducing it. So at least at this particular site, with those conditions, cold incoming water, outdoor source air, we had no capacity to shift load. We were sort of, just trying to break even. And we might have gotten like an energy factor, field energy factor of like 2.0 in the winter, where they're like 3.3.
Gotcha. So there's some caveats there. And Greg, could you post a link to the paper that discusses this in more detail in the chat, please?
Yeah, I can do that.
That'd be awesome.